I always remember the day it began because nothing about it felt unusual at first. It was late winter, the kind of cold that dulls the edges of everything, and I was walking home from my shift at the small logistics warehouse on the edge of town. The sky had already turned dark even though it was barely 6 in the evening, and the street lights were glowing with that weak yellow shimmer that never seems to chase the shadows away. I remember thinking how strangely quiet the road was, how the hum of traffic felt muffled like someone had thrown a blanket over the whole street. Maybe that was the first sign that something was off, or maybe I noticed it later only because I wanted a reason for everything that followed. I lived alone back then, in a cramped apartment on the 3rd floor of a building that constantly smelled of rusted pipes and damp concrete. My routine was simple. I cooked, ate, scrolled through my phone, and slept. Nothing about my life had sharp corners or strong colors. It was just quiet, predictable monotony. Maybe that monotony made me vulnerable. Maybe that's why I didn't realize the danger until it was too late. That night, when I unlocked my door, I felt a shift in the air. Not colder, not warmer, just disturbed, like the room had been waiting. I remember standing in the doorway longer than usual, staring into the stillness. Everything looked the same: the unmade bed, the shoes by the door, the cup I'd left by the sink. But something felt wrong beneath the surface, like the moment before a storm breaks. I ignored it and walked in. I should not have. I set my bag down and started heating water for tea, trying to convince myself the unease was just exhaustion. But while I waited for the water to boil, I kept glancing toward the hallway that led to my bedroom. I can't explain why. It felt like someone was standing just out of sight, watching quietly, not threatening, just present. I told myself I was being paranoid, yet every few minutes that sensation grew heavier, like a weight pressing between my shoulder blades. Later that night, long after I turned off the lights, I woke up to a faint sound. It wasn't loud enough to identify, just a soft shift of air, like someone adjusting their stance. I sat up, heart hammering, trying to see through the darkness. My apartment was too small for sounds to disguise themselves. There was nowhere for anything to hide. Still, I felt it, the awareness of another presence in the room. I didn't move. I barely breathed. For several minutes I stayed frozen, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. The silence stretched so long I began to doubt myself. Maybe the sound had come from outside. Maybe the building creaked. Eventually I lay back down, though the sense of being watched lingered long after I fell into a shallow, restless sleep. Over the next week, it got worse. Small things at first. Items slightly out of place. My keys moved a few inches from where I left them. A chair nudged away from the table. The bathroom door half open, when I always kept it shut. Each time I brushed it off as forgetfulness. But deep inside, a knot was tightening, telling me I was lying to myself. The turning point came on a Thursday night. I had taken a long shower after work, trying to ease the constant fatigue in my bones. When I stepped out, the mirror was fogged over except for one clean streak, perfectly vertical, as if someone had run a finger down the center. I stared at it, waiting for some logical explanation, but none came. I never touched the glass. I never wiped it. Yet there it was, a single line cutting through the steam. That was the first time I felt real fear. The kind that crawls beneath your skin and settles deep in your chest. The kind that whispers you are not alone. I barely slept that night. Every sound, every creak of the building made my muscles tense. I kept trying to reason with myself, but logic doesn't do much against instinct screaming danger. I started checking the locks multiple times before bed. I pushed a chair against the door. I slept with the hall light on. Still, the feeling remained. Then came the darkest time. The night I learned the truth. I had fallen asleep near dawn after hours of tossing. The air felt heavy, thick enough to choke on. When I woke, it wasn't to a sound but to a feeling, a shift of weight at the edge of my bed. My eyes snapped open. I didn't see anyone, but I knew someone was sitting there. The mattress dipped slightly, a faint but undeniable curve. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. My mind spun wildly, trying to explain it, trying to deny it, but the truth settled like ice in my stomach. Someone was inside my apartment. Someone had been inside for days. Watching. Waiting. I don't know how long I lay frozen like that. Seconds, minutes, it all blurred. Then, slowly, the pressure on the mattress lifted, as if the unseen presence had stood up. I listened to the soft shift of weight on the floor, footsteps so gentle they almost felt deliberate. Controlled. They moved toward the hallway. Then silence. I finally forced myself to move, inching toward the edge of the bed, straining my ears. My heart pounded so hard I felt it in my throat. When I heard the faintest rustle near the kitchen, I bolted. I sprinted to the front door, yanked it open, and stumbled into the hallway barefoot, trembling, breathless. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I waited outside until my neighbor woke up and let me stay inside her apartment while I called the police. They searched every corner of mine. They found no one. At least, not at first. It wasn't until one officer checked the built-in cabinet above the closet, an old storage space I had never used, that they discovered the truth. The wooden panel had been pried loose from inside, and behind it was a narrow cavity, barely big enough for a person to crawl into. Inside they found a blanket, food wrappers, a small flashlight, and a phone charger snaked through a hole in the wall. The officer told me someone had been living in that space for days, maybe weeks. They never found the person. The police stationed a patrol near the building for a while, but after nothing turned up, the case went cold. I moved out within a month, unable to stay in the place where I had slept while someone hid just a few feet away, watching quietly, waiting for the darkest time to reveal itself. But here's the part one can't forget, the part that keeps me awake even now. On the morning I left the apartment for the last time, I went back inside to check that I hadn't left anything behind. As I stood in the empty bedroom, I noticed the closet door was slightly open. A thin strip of darkness showed between the door and the frame. I reached out to push it shut, but before my hand touched it, the door moved, just a subtle shift, as if someone on the other side had pressed their palm against it. I backed away slowly, heart stuttering, telling myself I imagined it, telling myself it was just settling wood, or a draft, or anything but what it felt like. I left without closing the door, and sometimes late at night, I still wonder if someone was standing there in the darkness, watching me leave. I remember the smell before anything else. It was sharp, acidic, something between metal and damp soil. It lingered in the hallway of my apartment, building the evening everything started, but I convinced myself it was nothing. Old buildings have old smells. That's what I told myself as I climbed the stairwell, one hand dragging along the cold railing, my breath fogging in the stale air. I had no idea that this small, unpleasant scent would become the first sign of the darkest days I have ever lived through. I lived on the second floor, in a narrow corridor where the lights flickered every few minutes and footsteps echoed like there were twice as many people walking. That night, my footsteps sounded too loud, too alone. Something about the silence felt wrong, like the building was holding its breath. Even the usual barking of the neighbor's dog was missing. I should have noticed. I should have listened to that instinct telling me to turn around and leave. But instincts are quiet until it's too late. The moment I put my key into my door, I felt resistance. Not the normal kind, not a jammed lock or a swollen frame. It felt like something soft was behind the door, something shifting slightly as I tried to push. I froze with the key halfway turned. I waited. The resistance went away. The door moved normally. I opened it, stepped inside, and locked it behind me, telling myself fatigue was messing with my senses. Nothing seemed out of place at first. My shoes by the wall, the jacket I'd tossed on the chair that morning, the faint hum of the fridge. But the smell from the hallway had followed me inside, and it felt heavier here, like it was seeping from the walls. I opened windows, sprayed air freshener, but the smell clung stubbornly. I tried to sleep early that night, but my mind kept circling back to that subtle push on the other side of the door. I replayed it again and again, wondering if someone had been standing there, listening, waiting for me to come home. The thought burrowed into my chest, keeping me awake until almost sunrise. The next morning, the smell was worse. It hit me the moment I stepped into the hallway. Other residents noticed too. People stood outside their doors, mumbling about sewer lines or mold or something dead in the vents. I listened quietly, pretending I wasn't scared. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt a prickling sensation across my shoulders, like someone farther down the hallway was watching all of us and enjoying the confusion. Later that evening, the building manager went door to door, asking if anyone had noticed anything unusual. I almost mentioned the push against my door, but something stopped me. Saying it out loud felt dangerous, like acknowledging it would make it real. He shrugged off the smell, promising to check the pipes, then left. That night is when things escalated. I fell asleep around midnight, lights off, blanket tight around me. I woke up sometime around 3 to a sound I couldn't place. Slow, steady breathing. Not mine. Not near me. It came from the other side of my bedroom wall. I held still, listening. It was unmistakable. Someone was breathing, deep, slow, controlled, as though pacing their inhalations to stay quiet. I stared at the wall, imagining someone on the other side, standing in the darkness, face inches from mine with only plaster between us. I stayed awake until dawn, and by then the breathing had stopped. Over the next 2 days, more strange things happened. The smell grew stronger, thick enough to burn at the back of my throat. I noticed scratches near the bottom of my front door, thin and erratic, like someone had dragged a dull object along the wood. My mail began disappearing. A loaf of bread I had bought went missing from my counter. The drain in my shower was clogged with dark strands of hair, longer than mine. I called the building manager, but he wasn't answering anymore. A few neighbors said they hadn't seen him since the day he knocked on our doors. One woman claimed she heard someone moving around in his apartment late at night, but when she knocked, no one answered. By the 4th night, the fear had become a constant presence. I slept with the lights on, every lamp bathing the room in a weak glow that didn't feel strong enough. I pushed a dresser against my door. I kept my phone in my hand, convinced I'd need it at any second. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a series of soft taps. Slow, rhythmic. They came from inside the walls. Tap, tap, tap. I held my breath, waiting for it to stop. It didn't. The tapping moved along the wall, inching closer to my bedroom, then paused right behind my bed. That's when I heard the breathing again. Heavier this time. Closer. So close I could almost feel the vibration of it. I slid out of bed and pressed myself into the farthest corner of the room. I wanted to scream, but fear locked the sound in my throat. The tapping began again, faster now, like someone impatient or excited. I stared at the wall, unable to look away, imagining fingers scraping just on the other side. Suddenly, everything went silent. I stayed awake until sunrise again, shaking, barely able to keep my eyes open. When daylight finally broke, I forced myself out of the apartment and called the police. They searched the walls, the vents, the crawl spaces. They insisted the smell was due to a backed-up sewer line, told me the scratches were likely old, and the missing items were probably misplaced. They assured me no one was inside the walls. I knew they were wrong. The next evening, the hallway lights went out. All of them. The entire floor drowned in darkness. I stepped outside my apartment, phone flashlight shaking in my hand. I could hear movement somewhere near the stairwell, slow footsteps, dragging slightly. I backed into my apartment and locked the door. That night, something changed. The taps didn't come from the walls. They came from under my bed. 3 slow taps, then breathing. The kind of breathing that comes from someone lying on the ground, face pressed upward, waiting. I forced myself not to move, not to breathe loudly, not to run. I waited for the sound to stop. It didn't. Instead, I heard a soft shift, fabric brushing against wood. I bolted from the room, ran to the front door, and threw it open. I sprinted down the stairs barefoot, not stopping until I reached the street. I didn't go back inside. The police searched again the next morning. This time, they found a small access panel beneath my bedroom floorboards, hidden behind layers of old paint and dust. Inside the cavity was a narrow space big enough for a person to crawl through. There were food scraps, a stained pillow, a pile of clothes, and an old phone with the screen shattered. They told me someone had been living beneath me, moving through the crawl spaces, watching through cracks, listening, waiting, but they never caught him. I moved that same day, but the memory stayed. And sometimes late at night, when the room grows too quiet, I swear I still hear it. 3 soft taps, as if someone followed me.
I used to believe the darkest moments in life came suddenly, like a storm rolling in without warning. But the truth is, darkness rarely arrives all at once. It seeps in slowly, like water through a crack, until everything you once recognized becomes warped and dangerous. That is how it happened to me. Not with a crash, but with a quiet, lingering presence that I tried to ignore for far too long. It started the week I moved into the old rental house at the edge of town. I didn't choose it because I liked it. I chose it because it was cheap, close to my new job, and available immediately. The landlord barely spoke to me, just handed me the keys, told me the previous tenant left a mess in the shed, and drove off before I could even ask about trash collection. The house wasn't terrible, just old. The kind of old that creaks even when no one is walking. The kind of old where the walls seem to remember too much. On my first night there, I noticed something peculiar. Near the back of the hallway, close to the door that led to the basement, the air felt colder. Not a natural coldness, not the kind caused by drafty windows. It felt contained, like a pocket of chilled air lingering in one place. I passed through it over and over, expecting it to fade, but it remained, unmoving and deliberate. I told myself the insulation was bad. That explanation should have been enough. It wasn't. The second night, as I was brushing my teeth, I heard the faintest creak from the hallway behind me. When I stepped out of the bathroom, the cold spot felt stronger, as if the temperature had dropped drastically in just minutes. I touched the wall, expecting it to feel icy, but it was warm. The coldness was in the air alone, a pocket of frost suspended in a single point. I walked through it again and again, baffled, a knot forming deep in my stomach. The third night was when I realized something was truly wrong. I had just turned off the living room lights and was walking toward my bedroom when I felt the cold spot shift. Not the air itself, but the location. It wasn't by the basement door anymore. It was closer, much closer. I stepped back instinctively, my skin prickling. The cold moved again, sliding through the hallway like a slow, deliberate breath. It stopped near the bathroom door, waiting. I stood there in the dark, frozen in place, trying to convince myself there was a rational explanation. But I could feel it. The cold wasn't a temperature problem. It was a presence. That night, I barely slept. Over the next few days, the cold spot grew larger. It no longer stayed in one part of the house. Sometimes it hovered near the kitchen. Sometimes the living room. Sometimes, late at night, I would wake to the sensation of cold air brushing against my legs beneath the blankets, drifting up to my chest, lingering at my face until my breath felt thin and shaky. I started sleeping with the lights on. It didn't help. Then the sounds began. They were soft at first. A faint shifting of floorboards in the hallway. A quiet scrape like fabric brushing against wood. A slow tap near the window late at night, always too gentle to be wind. I checked the locks constantly. I checked under the bed. I checked the shed, the attic, the basement. Nothing ever looked disturbed, yet I felt watched every second I was awake. One evening, just before dusk, I found something that made my blood run cold. I had come home from work and tossed my jacket onto the couch, like I always did. When I walked into the kitchen to heat up leftovers, I noticed something on the floor. A small, dusty footprint near the fridge.
Bare. Thin.
Much smaller than my foot. I crouched down and touched the outline. The dust wasn't old. It smeared easily against my fingers. Someone had been inside the house. Someone had walked barefoot on my floor. I checked all the doors and windows again. Every lock, every possible entry point, but nothing looked forced. I tried calling the landlord, but he didn't answer any of the numbers he'd given me. By then, fear had settled deep into my bones. It didn't fade. It grew heavier with every passing hour. 2 nights later, everything reached a point I cannot forget. I had been trying to sleep for hours, surrounded by silence, so thick it felt unnatural. The cold spot had drifted to the far corner of my bedroom, unmoving for once. I lay still, eyes half closed, telling myself I would get through the night if I stayed calm. Then I heard it, a faint tap near the closet door.
Slow.
Deliberate. I held my breath, listening. Another tap followed, slightly louder. Then another. I stared at the closet, heart pounding so violently I felt it in my throat. The tapping continued steadily, almost rhythmic, like someone inside was testing the wood, searching for a weak point. Finally, it stopped. Silence swallowed the room. For a few long seconds, nothing happened. Then the closet door moved. Not much. Just a small shift, the tiniest tilt, as if something had pressed lightly against the inside. I scrambled up, grabbed my phone, and backed toward the door, legs shaking. Another shift. The door opened wider, only an inch or two, but enough to let darkness spill into the already dim room. I ran. I didn't think. I bolted out of the room, down the hall, and straight out the front door into the cold night air. I didn't stop running until I reached the end of the street. I stood there trembling, breathless, staring at the house from a distance. No lights moved. No shadows past the windows, but I could feel something inside watching from behind the glass. The police arrived quickly after I called. They searched the entire house, room by room, closet by closet. They checked the basement, the attic, the crawl spaces. They found nothing. But when the officer opened the shed behind the house, he paused. Inside, stacked neatly in the corner, were several items that belonged to me. A pair of socks, a glass from my kitchen, a small notebook, and on top of the pile was something I hadn't noticed, missing yet. One of my shirts. It was folded perfectly, too neatly for someone in a hurry. The officer asked if I had placed the items there. I shook my head, but the worst discovery wasn't the objects. It was what they found behind the shed. A narrow gap ran between the wall of the shed and the wooden fence. Bare footprints covered the dirt, leading from the back door of my house to the shed, and then into the shadows behind the fence. The prints were fresh. They never found who made them. I moved out within the week. I left furniture, clothes, even appliances behind. I didn't care. I just wanted to get away from the house, from the cold spot, from the tapping and the shifting closet door. But the memory stayed with me. The presence stayed with me, lingering in the back of my mind like a shadow that refuses to leave. And sometimes, when I'm alone in my new apartment late at night, I feel a strange pocket of cold drifting through the hallway.
Slow.
Searching. I tell myself it's nothing, but I never sleep until the sun comes up. The darkest time of my life didn't start with a scream or a crash or anything dramatic. It began with a sound so ordinary I almost ignored it completely. A soft, repetitive knocking from somewhere inside the walls of my apartment. At first, I thought it was pipes. Old buildings groan and shift all the time. But this was different. It had rhythm, intention, and most unsettling of all, it happened only when the apartment grew quiet, long after midnight, when the world outside settled into silence. I had moved into that apartment only a month earlier. A small, worn place on the 5th floor of a building sandwiched between two busy streets. I chose it for the price, not the charm. The wallpaper was peeling in every room. The windows rattled when buses passed by. The hallway lights flickered so often that I suspected the building manager swapped bulbs only when a tenant complained loud enough. But it was mine, and after years of couch surfing and cheap shared rooms, having a space of my own felt like a beginning. The first time I heard the knocking was a Thursday night. I had been lying in bed, half asleep, when a faint tap against the wall jolted me upright. Then another, then a third. Even spacing, no rush, no randomness. I sat there listening, trying to decide if I should get up and check. I didn't. I assumed it was a neighbor. I tried to sleep again, but the sound continued for nearly an hour before abruptly stopping. The next morning, I laughed it off, telling myself it must have been plumbing or some clueless tenant rearranging furniture at insane hours. But the sound returned the next night, this time lower, slower, like someone dragging their knuckles across the other side of the wall. I knocked back once out of irritation. Silence. Then 2 slow taps answered. I didn't sleep at all that night. Over the next week, the knocking grew bolder. It would start around 1 a.m., sometimes lasting minutes, sometimes stretching until sunrise. I tried everything. Earplugs, music, white noise. Nothing drowned it out. It felt personal, like it was meant specifically for me. Like something behind the walls wanted my attention, and the more I ignored it, the more persistent it became. By the 4th night, fear had replaced irritation. I noticed the knocking only happened when I was alone. If a friend came over, if I stayed up video chatting someone, or if I kept the TV playing loudly, the apartment remained silent. The moment I turned everything off, the moment I sat in stillness, the knocking began. During the day, strange things started happening too. My kitchen drawers were sometimes left slightly open. Items moved just enough for me to question whether I had misplaced them. The bathroom mirror would fog in a narrow vertical streak even when I hadn't showered. And every afternoon when I returned from work, I found the living room curtains parted slightly, even though I always kept them fully closed. I reached out to my neighbor across the hall, hoping he had noticed something strange too. He looked tired, distracted, barely present. He told me he worked nights and rarely heard anything in the building. When I asked about the knocking, he shrugged and muttered something about pipes and thin walls. He shut his door before I could ask anything else. That was the first time I wondered if he was hiding something. The following night was the moment everything shifted from unsettling to terrifying. I had been lying on the couch watching old videos on my phone when the knocking started, but this time it came from the ceiling instead of the walls. A slow, steady tap right above me, like someone crawling across the attic floor. Except the building didn't have attics. The top floor was directly above me. I climbed onto a chair and pressed my ear to the ceiling. The tapping grew louder, faster, almost eager. I stumbled back, heart racing. I slept with the lights on until sunrise. By the end of the week, the knocking had spread. It no longer came from one wall or ceiling. Sometimes it echoed from the kitchen cabinets. Sometimes from inside the bathroom walls. Once, horrifyingly, from beneath my bed. I started leaving my apartment for long stretches of time, lingering at cafes or wandering the streets until exhaustion forced me home. But the moment I unlocked the door each night, a cold, stale air greeted me, as if the apartment had been holding its breath while waiting for me to return. The breaking point came on a Monday night. I had arrived home later than usual, hoping the knocking might stop if I disrupted my routine. I changed, brushed my teeth, and forced myself to lie in bed with the lights off for the first time in days. The room was silent. I felt silly for how afraid I had become. Maybe it really was just the building settling. Maybe my stress was amplifying every noise. Then I heard it. Not tapping. Breathing. Soft, slow breathing directly beneath me, as if someone were lying under the bed, mirroring my position. Inhale. Exhale.
Calm.
Controlled. I froze. My heartbeat so loud I was sure whoever was beneath me could hear it. I slid off the bed as quietly as possible and backed into the corner of the room. The breathing stopped. I didn't look under the bed. I ran. I raced down the stairs barefoot, shaking, unable to process what I had just heard. I didn't stop until I reached the building's entrance. I waited outside until morning, too terrified to go back inside. When the police inspected the apartment the next day, they found something that still haunts me. Behind the large built-in cabinet in my bedroom, the one I never used, there was a gap. A narrow cavity between the cabinet and the wall. And inside that gap, hidden beneath a layer of insulation, they found signs of someone having crawled through repeatedly. Fingerprints along the wood. A flattened section of insulation. A small warm spot where someone had been resting recently. Someone had been living in the walls. Someone had been watching me. The police searched the building for hours, but they found no one. They questioned the neighbor across the hall, who now looked even more exhausted, his hands shaking as he spoke. He insisted he knew nothing, but the way he avoided looking at my door told me he knew more than he was willing to share. I moved out that same afternoon, but the darkest part wasn't what the police found. It wasn't the knocking or the breathing or the signs that someone had been slipping through the walls behind me. It was the note I found inside the pocket of a jacket I never wore. A note I didn't write. A note in messy, rushed handwriting. It read only one sentence. I liked the nights you stayed quiet.
I remember the first night I noticed the silhouette on the ridge. It was early winter, the kind of cold that made the air feel thin and sharp, and I had taken the long route home just to clear my head after another shift that stretched too late. That ridge always sat above the road like a silent crown of trees, tall and unmoving, but that night something broke the usual shape of it. A thin, upright figure stood at the crest, too still to be a passing hiker and too tall to be a child playing tricks. I slowed only for a second, long enough for the image to settle into my memory, and continued driving. I told myself someone was just walking a late-night trail, but something about the rigid posture made my stomach tighten, as if I had brushed against something dangerous without realizing it. The next morning, the ridge looked normal again. Even so, I felt uneasy every time I passed it. I tried to keep my eyes on the road, but the memory of that unmoving figure kept pulling my attention back, like an itch under the skin. 2 nights later, I saw it again. Same position, same posture. This time I stopped the car. I waited for movement, any hint of a shift, but the silhouette remained fixed. My fingers hovered near the horn, but I hesitated. Drawing attention to myself felt wrong, like I would be inviting something I wasn't prepared for. Eventually I drove off, telling myself not to obsess over it. By the end of the week, it became part of my commute. Sometimes the ridge was empty. Sometimes it wasn't. Each time I saw it, a strange tightening formed around my chest. I tried to dismiss it as someone camping or surveying land, but the consistency made that impossible. Whoever it was, they always stood the same way, facing the road, motionless as if waiting. As if watching, the uneasiness seeped into the rest of my life. I slept poorly, waking at odd hours with the sense that something wasn't right, though I could never name what. At work I found myself glancing at windows, expecting to see a tall silhouette outside, even though I worked on the third floor. My co-workers noticed I was distracted, but I brushed off their questions, pretending I was simply tired. The truth felt too strange to speak out loud, but giving form to it would make it more real. One Saturday, after a long morning of trying to convince myself the whole thing was harmless, I decided to hike up to the hill. It was broad daylight, and the path was simple. There was no reason to be afraid. Still, my hands felt cold as I started up the trail. The climb wasn't long, but every step made my pulse beat a little faster. When I reached the top, the clearing was empty. No footprints, no signs of someone spending time there. The view overlooked the road perfectly, though a clear vantage point that made a shiver crawl up my spine. Whoever stood there had chosen the only spot where they could be seen without being approached easily. I wanted to rationalize it. I searched around the area for any evidence of repeated visits. Trampled grass, cigarette butts, food wrappers. There was nothing. The ground looked untouched, pristine, as if no one had walked there in weeks. I left feeling more uneasy than when I arrived. That night, I noticed something new. The silhouette stood slightly closer to the edge of the ridge, as if it had stepped forward. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. The figure was clearer than before. Dark clothes, long limbs, no identifiable features, but the outline alone made my breath feel shallow. I pressed the gas and didn't look back. Over the next few days, the figure continued appearing closer to the road. Not by much, just enough to notice and return attention. And I was. Every night, I felt the weight of its unseen gaze on the back of my neck as I passed. I began leaving work earlier, hoping to avoid the ridge at night. But even during dusk, the figure sometimes remained there, a fixed point on the fading road. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I started taking the old back road home, even though it added 20 minutes to the drive. For a few days, that helped. My shoulders relaxed. My sleep improved slightly. I convinced myself that whatever was happening on the ridge would fade from my thoughts and feelings. But deep down, I knew I was only avoiding a problem that wasn't coming. One evening, after staying late to finish overdue paperwork, I forgot about the ridge entirely. I drove on autopilot, and by the time I realized I was on the original route, the ridge was already running ahead. I felt a cold rush of dread. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I approached the familiar ground. The silhouette was gone. At first I felt relief, almost overwhelming. I slowed down, letting out a shaky breath, thinking maybe it was finally over. But as my headlights swept the side of the road, that relief curdled into something far darker. There, standing just beyond the guardrail, barely illuminated by my headlights, was the same tall figure. No longer distant, no longer separated by a ridge. Standing at the edge of the road, as if waiting for me. My entire body froze. The figure didn't move, but its presence felt pressing, heavy, like the air itself was looking around me. I didn't dare stop. I accelerated, eyes fixed ahead, resisting every urge to glance around. I didn't want to know if it remained there, or if it turned to watch me. I took the back road every night after that, no matter how late or exhausted I felt. But the dread didn't fade this time. I always felt like something unseen was following me just out of sight, matching the rhythm of my feet. I avoided the ridge entirely, even on weekends, but the memory of seeing that figure so close burrowed deep into my mind. 2 weeks passed before curiosity overpowered me. I drove the original route again in broad daylight, wanting to prove to myself that there had been nothing more than a trip to the dust. When I reached the spot where the figure had stood, the guardrail looked familiar. No footprints, no disturbed gravel, nothing to indicate a person had ever stood there. Yet something new drew my attention. On the metal rail, at the precise point where I had seen the figure, someone had carved a single line into the surface. A vertical slash about the length of my hand, straight and deep, cut into the steel as if by something far sharper than any ordinary tool. It looked fresh, clean, intentional. Seeing that mark made something settle inside me, something cold and certain. The figure wasn't random. It wasn't a passing stranger. It was deliberate, and whatever purpose it hadn't ended that night on the road. I left quickly, forcing myself not to look back. But ever since then, I've felt that same watching sensation everywhere I go, even in crowded places, even in daylight. I don't see the figure anymore, yet the sense of being observed has only grown sharper over time. Sometimes I wonder if the rig was only a dream, and if the real reason it stepped down to the roadside wasn't that it wanted to see me clearly, but that it wanted me to know it was done later. The memory begins with the snow, damp concrete mixed with something metallic, the kind that settles into the back of your throat and stays there long after you left your place. I first noticed it the week I moved into that basement apartment. It wasn't a real apartment, not officially. More like a converted storage level with 2 rooms, a low ceiling, and a single narrow window facing the alley. It was cheap, and cheap was all I could afford after losing my teacher's job. I told myself I could handle it for a few months. I told myself a lot of things back then. The smell wasn't what frightened me at first. It was the stillness. That floor was too quiet, like the building above had forgotten it existed. Even the pipes sounded muted, as if wrapped in cloth. The hallway lights flickered in slow, irregular rhythm that made walking to my door feel like passing through a place I hadn't seen in the country. The landlord claimed the wiring in the building was funky. I accepted that explanation because I needed the room more than I needed peace. The first night I slept there, I woke around 3 in the morning to a faint vibration against the wall behind my bed. It was steady, rhythmic, almost like someone tapping, but softly and uncaused. I pressed my ear to the wall. The tapping went on for a minute, and stopped abruptly. I convinced myself it had to be the pipe. Everything in old buildings can be blamed with pipes. Over the next few days, I settled into a routine. I bought cheap furniture, tried to ignore the damp falling through the drywall, and kept telling myself the basement was getting normal once I got in. But the tapping continued, always between 2 and 4 in the morning. Always the same pattern. Slow, deliberate. I tried to map the layout of the building in my head to figure out the movement of doors, but the basement didn't connect neatly to the floors above. My only neighbor on that level was the storage room beside my room. The landlord claimed no one had access to it except maintenance staff, and they rarely came down there. Yet the tapping came from that direction every time. One evening, after another long day searching for work, I returned to find something strange. A faint scrape near the bottom of my floor. It looked like someone had dragged a thin object across it, leaving a shallow line in front. I knelt down, heart beating faster than it should have, and noticed the smallest piece of concrete dust near the threshold, just enough to make me wonder if someone had been tampering with the flame. I tried the lock. It worked. I told myself it was nothing, but the unease grew thicker with each passing day. I began sleeping with the lamp on, something I hadn't done since childhood. I kept my shoes lined by the door, ready to grab if I needed to. The tapping continued almost every night, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever, or whatever, caused it was becoming more purposeful. One Thursday afternoon, I returned unexpectedly early and found the hallway burning hot. The overhead light flickered more violently, and the air felt colder. I heard movement coming from the storage room. Not the subtle shuffling of boxes settling, but the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate. I froze in front of my door, listening as the steps approached the thin wall dividing my apartment from the storage space. Then silence. I should have left them. I should have packed and never returned. But I told myself I was imagining things born out of stress and sleepless nights. I convinced myself to unlock my door and step inside. That night, the tapping didn't come. Instead, something else happened. Around 4 in the morning, I heard breathing. Not my own. Deep, measured breaths coming from the other side of the wall. I sat up in bed, listening. The breathing was close, as if someone had pressed their face right against the other side of the drywall. I waited for it to stop, but it didn't. It remained steady, patient, almost calm. I sat there listening until dawn, too terrified to move. The next morning, I called the landlord, trying to sound casual as I asked whether anyone had been in the basement recently. He insisted no one had. Maintenance hadn't visited the storage room in months. He sounded annoyed, as if I was wasting his time. After I hung up, the silence in my apartment felt heavy. I knew I couldn't pretend anymore. I decided to investigate the storage room myself. The lock on its door was old, metal bolts with holes. keyhole was scratched, far more worn than it should have been if no one used it. I pressed my ear to the door and heard nothing. No breathing, no movement, just a suffocating stillness. I considered trying to hide it, but fear rooted my throat. I backed away and returned to my apartment, locking the door behind me and trembling hands. That evening, I pushed my dresser against the shared wall. It was an act of desperation, an attempt to create even the smallest barrier between myself and whatever occupied the storage room. The tapping didn't return, nor did the breathing. For the first time in weeks, I slept more than a few hours. I thought maybe the worst was over. I was wrong. 2 nights later, I woke to the sound of the cracking, a dry, splintering noise, unmistakably close. I looked toward the dresser just in time to see a thin line appear across the surface, as if something was pressing against it from the other side. The line deepened slowly and methodically, like someone dragging a sharp object through the wood. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I watched as the line grew longer and stopped abruptly. The silence that followed felt alive. I didn't wait for morning. I grabbed my bag, my jacket, and my shoes, and I left without looking back. I didn't care about my furniture or the deposit I never looked back. I just wanted out. I moved across town that same week into a small room above the basement. The noise, the warmth, the constant activity. Everyone else found it annoying, but I clung to it like a lifeline. I tried to rebuild my life, telling myself the basement would be nothing more than bad news. A month passed before I heard from the landlord again. He called to tell me someone had broken into the basement storage room. The door had been found splintered from the inside. Whatever was in there had forced its way out. He asked if I had noticed anything unusual before I left. I told him no, but now, some nights, when the street outside is quiet and the bakery lights go dark, I hear something creak. A slow, deliberate tapping just beneath the floorboards, as if something was trying to find its way out. And every time I hear it, I know with a sinking certainty that it isn't finished with me. CCC.